Tell me, Patriot, have you ever witnessed dignity being stripped from someone who carried nothing but faith, courage, and the will to survive? Have you seen freedom mocked not by enemies in red coats, but by those who claim to stand beside you in this struggle for a new nation? Abigail had walked for miles through cold wind and mud, clutching nothing but a worn satchel and the hope that her husband's regiment would accept her presence. She arrived quietly at the Patriot encampment, head bowed, clothes simple, her steps careful, almost apologetic. But instead of compassion, she met humiliation. Colonial soldiers, men who preached sacrifice and unity, laughed at her plain dress, her lack of insignias, her silence. They spoke to her as if she were a servant, as if her worth were measured only by the shine of her boots or the cut of her coat. And yet, behind her calm eyes burned something they could not see, the resilience of a woman who had crossed valleys and rivers for family, for love, for the dream of a land where no one would bow ever again. Abigail stood there, surrounded by mockery but unbroken. Her humiliation would soon become a test, one that would reveal who truly understood the meaning of freedom. Patriot, before we march into this story of betrayal, struggle, and quiet sacrifice, are you already subscribed? If not, join us, leave your like, and stand with those who refuse to kneel. All right then, now we can begin. Abigail felt the weight of their sneers long before. Any hand pushed her aside. The camp was a battlefield of egos, colonial officers strutting between tents, as if each ragged coat were a noble's uniform, each torn boot a symbol of imagined superiority. They argued about tactics they barely understood, boasted of victories they had never earned, and measured their worth not by courage, but by how loudly they could diminish someone else. In that atmosphere of rivalry and wounded pride, Abigail became an easy target, a mirror they despised, a reminder of the humility they feared. One officer blocked her path, chin raised, eyes cold with concealed insecurity. He mocked her silence, asked whose servant she was, and laughed when she refused to answer. Another gestured dismissively, as if brushing away dust. Their disdain grew bolder with each insult, feeding off the shame they tried to impose on her. Yet Abigail did not tremble. She carried a deeper resolve, born from nights praying for her family's safety, days struggling for simple dignity, and the unspoken belief that liberty required more than muskets and declarations. It demanded humanity. Around her, poor farmers and weary militiamen watched from the shadows, trapped between compassion and fear of drawing the officer's wrath. They too had tasted disgrace from English nobles, but now they witnessed degradation coming from men who claimed to fight for independence. Abigail saw it clearly, a rebellion torn from within, poisoned by vanity, weakened by betrayal of its own values. Still, she moved forward, quiet, steady, waiting for the moment when truth would surface, when hidden motives would be exposed, and when each man, officer or common soldier, would be forced to confront the consequences of his decisions. The camp held more secrets than any of them wished to admit, and Abigail's presence was about to pull those shadows into the open. Her journey through that fractured encampment was only beginning, and the revelations waiting ahead would change far more than the pride of a few arrogant officers. The officers gathered the men at the clearing, barking orders with the desperation of those who needed to prove authority rather than earn it. The morning air was cold, sharp, filled with the tension of a rebellion fighting itself. No British uniforms in sight, only patriots turning their muskets on imagined foes, staging attacks, counter-attacks, and chaotic charges as if choreography alone could grant them the strength to defend liberty. What should have been a lesson in unity became a parade of vanity. Each officer screamed louder than the last, competing for dominance, eager to display command, while ignoring the weary faces of poor farmers and untrained militiamen who could barely hold their rifles steady. Abigail watched from the edge, her hands gripping the satchel pressed against her chest. Every harsh shout reminded her that this struggle for independence was bleeding dignity before a single British blade touched the camp. Men stumbled through drills, pushed and mocked when they failed to match the officers' expectations. A frail elder, trembling from cold and exhaustion, collapsed during a simulated retreat. Instead of compassion, he received ridicule, a reminder that even within the ranks of the oppressed, there were those who tried to imitate the arrogance of their oppressors. The exercises escalated. Dust rose, tempers flared, rivalries sharpened. A young militiaman hesitated during a flanking maneuver and was immediately dragged forward and humiliated before the entire unit. The officers called it discipline, but Abigail saw only degradation born from fear and insecurity. These were not leaders guiding a nation toward independence. They were fractured men hiding behind rank, terrified of their own inadequacy. Still, beneath the noise, something deeper stirred. Abigail sensed it in the way a few soldiers exchanged glances of quiet rebellion, tired of the insults, tired of betrayal within their own cause. She felt it in the silent resolve of the overlooked, the simple, the poor, the forgotten, whose sacrifices carried the true weight of this struggle. Their journey was not driven by ego, but by the dream of a land where dignity belonged to all, not only to those who shouted the loudest. The drills continued, more frantic, more desperate, until the encampment itself seemed ready to break under the pressure of clashing ambitions. And as Abigail stepped closer, drawn by an intuition she could not ignore, she realized these chaotic exercises were only the beginning of a transformation that would soon expose hidden truths far more dangerous than any mock battle. The failures began subtly, almost disguised beneath the noise of marching boots and shouted commands. But arrogance has a way of revealing itself, even when wrapped in the colors of rebellion. As the tactical exercises intensified, the officers grew reckless. They abandoned the few rules meant to protect the weaker recruits. They ignored the presence of simulated civilians, women, elders, children made of straw bundles, meant to remind them who they were fighting for. Instead of guiding their men with discipline, they charged blindly into every drill, as if victory depended on impulse rather than judgment. Their desperation poisoned every maneuver. In one exercise, an officer ordered a flanking advance directly through the zone marked as a civilian refuge. He knew the rule. He chose to break it. The men following him hesitated, torn between obedience and conscience, yet the officer barked louder, drowning their doubts. They trampled the markers without shame. Abigail, standing close enough to witness the degradation, felt a sharp ache in her chest. How could a cause built on liberty disregard its own people so easily? How could men claiming to defend independence show such contempt for the lives they pretended to safeguard? The drills devolved further. Commands contradicted one another. Units collided. A mock retreat turned disastrous when two officers fought over who should lead it, screaming insults as their men stumbled in confusion. A young farmer, barely strong enough to bear the weight of his musket, was pushed to the ground by a panicked soldier, obeying orders that shifted with every breath. The shame on the boy's face was unmistakable, humiliation not inflicted by English generals, but by the very patriots sworn to protect him. Another drill simulated an English raid on the supply wagons. Instead of coordinating a defense, the officers sprinted ahead to claim imagined glory. They left their rear exposed. They left their wounded behind. They left the recruits bewildered and vulnerable. A militia soldier with graying hair tried to call out warnings, urging caution, but an officer silenced him with a curt gesture, treating decades of wisdom like an inconvenience. That moment revealed a hidden truth Abigail had sensed since her arrival. This rebellion risked breaking long before any British bayonet pierced their lines, not from lack of weapons, not from lack of heart, but from betrayal within, from decisions shaped by selfish pride rather than collective sacrifice. Dust choked the air as the officers stumbled again, failing to anticipate a simple feint. Their commands collapsed, their formation shattered. The exercise ended in disgrace. Men groaned in frustration. Others exchanged glances heavy with doubt, as if the fragile thread holding their hope together might snap at any second. Abigail saw their despair. She felt it rising in her own chest, a cold realization spreading through her bones. If this chaos continued, if pride kept guiding their steps, the dream of independence would crumble. Yet within that dark moment, something else stirred. A quiet rebellion. Not against the English this time, but against the defects corroding the Patriots from within. Several soldiers stepped away from the field, gathering near Abigail, their expressions heavy with disappointment and silent resolve. They did not speak, but she sensed an emerging unity, a transformation born not from command, but from shared suffering. These men carried the true heart of the struggle. They were tired of disgrace, tired of being treated as pawns, tired of leaders who cherished rank more than dignity. Abigail's gaze drifted back to the officers, now arguing among themselves, each trying to deflect blame. That confusion, that insecurity, that blindness, it would not remain hidden much longer. Something was approaching, a moment capable of revealing every fracture, every concealed motive, every shadow festering beneath the flag they claimed to honor. And as the wind swept across the encampment, lifting the scent of dust and sweat, Abigail sensed that the next revelation would not simply expose their failures. It would test the spirit of all who still believed in liberty and force the camp to confront truths it could no longer ignore. Abigail was sent on the pilot, mission only because no officer wanted to risk embarrassment after the disastrous drills. They framed it as a trivial task, a simple reconnaissance through the woods east of the camp, nothing that could threaten their precious pride. But Abigail understood more than they expected. She read the terrain like scripture. She moved with the precision of someone who had lived her entire journey in silence and sacrifice. The forest swallowed her steps. Branches bent aside as if recognizing her resolve. Not a sound betrayed her presence. She found the markers swiftly, hidden flags meant to simulate supplies captured by an enemy patrol. She spotted the mock ambush positions from a distance, reading footprints, disturbed leaves, the faint scent of oil on the wind. She took note of everything with calm clarity. Where the officers had blundered, she adapted. Where they hesitated, she decided. Her path cut through the woods like a thread of intuition, and when she returned, every detail was accurate. Every signal memorized, every weakness exposed. It was the work of a seasoned scout, not the performance of a woman mocked as a servant. Yet when she stepped back into camp, the reaction was not respect. It was derision wrapped in thin laughter. A junior soldier, one who had failed every maneuver earlier, smirked and asked if she had simply followed animal tracks. Another officer skimmed her report with disinterest, pretending not to see the flawless observations. He dismissed her findings with a shrug, claiming luck. The shamelessness of their contempt struck deeper than any insult before. Still, Abigail did not raise her voice. She handed over the final notes, her fingers steady despite the sting of their degradation. She knew that dignity was not granted by those who feared competence. Liberty demanded more than praise. It demanded resilience in the face of betrayal, even when the betrayal came from allies blinded by pride. But the soldiers who had watched her leave and return, those tired, overlooked patriots shaped by fields and hunger, not medals, saw the truth. They had marched under officers drunk on their own image. They had lived under English nobles who saw them as replaceable shadows. And now they witnessed a transformation they could not ignore. A woman, treated like nothing, performing with a mastery none of their leaders could match. A revelation that cracked the fragile illusion of authority ruling the encampment. When Abigail walked past the fire pits, several young militiamen stepped aside with quiet reverence. They didn't speak, they didn't dare, but their eyes carried something new: faith, a spark of rebellion against the hierarchy that had belittled them for so long. Her journey had become more than survival. It was a threat to those who clung to power through shame and intimidation. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the camp's murmurs changed tone. A few officers whispered among themselves, uneasy. They felt something shifting, a hidden truth, slipping beyond their control. Abigail's success was not merely a task completed. It was a fracture widening beneath their boots, a sign that their authority, built on ego rather than sacrifice, was beginning to crumble. And as night slowly gathered around the encampment, Abigail sensed that her silent victory would soon collide with a storm none of them were prepared to face, a confrontation that would expose loyalties, force decisions, and test the fragile heartbeat of their fight for independence. Whispers spread through the camp like drifting smoke, slow at first, then gathering weight and shape. Men who had mocked Abigail hours earlier now watched her with uneasy eyes. Something in her stride unsettled them. Her steps were too deliberate. Her silence carried too much awareness. She moved not like a hesitant recruit, but like someone who had crossed harsher landscapes than any of them wished to imagine. Every gesture, every glance toward the tree line, every instinctive pause, when the wind shifted, betrayed a depth of experience far beyond what a simple colonial woman should possess. Two officers observed her from a distance, their faces tightened by suspicion. They whispered in low tones, hiding their concern beneath arrogance. They recognized movements they had only seen in hardened scouts or former soldiers who had survived ambushes and border skirmishes. Abigail's behavior did not match the story they had crafted for her. A quiet woman, a harmless shadow, someone to be dismissed. Instead, she carried the posture of someone who knew danger intimately, someone shaped by loss, someone trained by necessity, not command. A group of young militiamen noticed it too. They saw how she scanned the perimeter while pretending merely to fetch water, how she memorized the officers' routines, how she reacted to sudden noises with controlled, razor-sharp precision. For them, the revelation was not frightening, it was inspiring, a reminder that true strength often grows in silence, forged far from the eyes of generals and nobles who boasted about valor, yet trembled when real sacrifice was required. But to the officers, her competence was a threat. It exposed their ineptitude. It stripped away their illusions of leadership. Her presence alone felt like an act of rebellion against everything they believed granted them authority. They began questioning where she had learned such skills, what she had seen, what she was hiding. Their stares grew colder. Their pride, already bruised by their own failures, sought someone to blame. One officer approached her under the pretense of checking supplies. His smile was tight. His tone carried concealed hostility. He questioned her background, her journey, her reasons for being there. Abigail answered calmly, offering only what was necessary. But every word she spoke deepened his distrust. She refused to shrink, refused to apologize, refused to play the role they had assigned her. And that defiance, quiet, dignified, unwavering, felt more dangerous to them than any musket pointed at their chest. Around the fire, an older farmer murmured to another, noting how Abigail handled a blade while cutting rope. Swift, precise, efficient. Skills no ordinary settler should master unless shaped by tragedy or survival. His voice carried a mix of awe and sorrow, as if recognizing in her movements the echo of countless struggles endured by the oppressed across the colonies. People crushed by English merchants, humiliated by officers in crimson coats, driven from their land by nobles who believed liberty belonged only to the wealthy. Now, within the Patriot encampment itself, Abigail's abilities confronted a different kind of tyranny, a rot from within, men who mirrored their oppressors without even realizing it. As night deepened, the officers met privately, their silhouettes trembling against lantern light. Their voices rose, full of fear disguised as authority. They spoke of discipline, of protocol, but beneath their words hid a single, undeniable truth. Abigail's skill exposed the hidden weakness they had spent years concealing. And Abigail, standing alone by the dying embers of a campfire, felt a chill crawl across her spine, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that her quiet competence had awakened something dangerous. Pride wounded becomes unpredictable, and the decisions these officers made next would determine far more than her place in the camp. They could shape the fate of every man, dreaming of independence. The air trembled with an unspoken warning, and Abigail sensed that the confrontation she had tried so hard to avoid was drawing closer, carried forward by forces now impossible to stop. Dawn dragged a pale line over the ridge as the final exercise began. Drums rattled. Men formed ranks with stiff hands and hollow eyes. The field smelled of damp earth and fear. Officers strode out, chins lifted, each demanding attention, each insisting on command. What should have been a single voice turned into a chorus of contradictions. Advance, hold, pivot, fire. Orders crashed into one another like waves in a storm. Confusion spread fast. Confidence bled away. Abigail stood near the supply wagons, watching the lines falter. A captain demanded a charge on the left, while another screamed to fall back. The unit split. Muskets lifted against empty air, then swung toward their own flank by mistake. Shame flushed across young faces. A farmer dropped his powder horn in the mud and was shoved by a sergeant who needed a scapegoat. The boy's disgrace burned like a brand. No red uniform had done this to him. This humiliation came from men wearing the same ragged colors, men who preached independence, yet forgot its soul. The drill shifted to a village defense scenario. Straw figures represented families, elders, children. The officers argued over who had authority to place the pickets. No decision held long enough to matter. A simulated fire started downwind. The wind carried smoke through the ranks. Coughs turned to panic. One lieutenant called for a retreat behind the creek. Another ordered a forward rush to seize imagined high ground. The line fractured. Dignity cracked with it. Abigail ran to steady a fallen militiaman. Grey hair, trembling knees, breath wheezing in short bursts. He apologized as if his age were a crime. She lifted him without a word and guided him toward cover. A nearby officer saw only insubordination. He shouted at her for interfering. He threatened punishment. Abigail met his glare with a quiet, unyielding calm. The man turned away, unsettled by a strength he could not bend. Shots of blank powder thundered. The sound alone shook nerves. A squad surged through the village markers, trampling the place meant to protect civilians. Again the rules were ignored. Again conscience was smothered. The spectacle looked heroic only from a distance. Up close it was chaos disguised as courage. The louder the officers yelled, the smaller they became. Men began choosing whose voice to obey. Some followed the arrogant, some clung to the sensible. Others watched Abigail, not for orders, but for steadiness. She moved with purpose, marking safe routes, waving recruits away from blind corners, pointing to cover as smoke thickened. Her hands were quick. Her eyes cut through confusion. She spoke little, and when she did, it was to save someone, not to display power. A few soldiers started mirroring her decisions without even noticing. A quiet transformation unfolded beneath the noise. Then came the staged ambush. Drums beat hard. Pennants flashed. The enemy appeared from the woods, patriots pretending to be British, but the fear felt real. A snare line gave way. The rear guard drifted. Two squads wheeled in opposite directions and nearly collided. For a heartbeat, muskets aimed at friendly faces. Frozen shame, a breath from disaster. A single rash command could have turned the drill into tragedy. Before panic sealed it, Abigail stepped between the converging lines, raising both hands. No speech, no theatrics. A firm gesture to the ground. Hold. The nearest men calmed, their barrels dipped. One older soldier, his coat patched with rough stitches, echoed her motion down the line. The moment passed. Relief tasted like rain, but the officers resented it. They recognized the influence of someone without rank. They felt their brittle authority slip. One captain stalked toward her, anger masked as formality. He accused her of disrupting the chain of command. He claimed she'd sabotaged the exercise. His words cut, not because they held truth, but because they revealed the hidden wound in the camp. Pride, choking the very cause it claimed to serve. Arguments exploded among the leadership. Blame lunged from mouth to mouth. Betrayal hid behind courtesy. A major sneered that discipline was impossible with civilians meddling. Another spat that the untrained should stay silent. A third, quieter and more perceptive, said nothing but watched Abigail with a kind of wary respect, as if weighing the cost of listening. Meanwhile, the rank and file drifted into clusters, protective circles of men who shared bread and grief, not glory. They spoke in low tones of English merchants who had seized their harvest at unfair prices, of officers in scarlet who laughed at their petitions, of nobles who called them rabble, then demanded their sons for labor. They did not fight for vanity. They fought for the right to stand upright, for a piece of land to bury their dead without permission, for a future where their children would not bow to a sneer. The exercise resumed in fragments. Signals contradicted. Drummers faltered. A courier sprinted with a message that had already been replaced by a new command. The ground itself seemed tired of carrying so much confusion, yet amid the wreckage of pride, a pattern emerged. The soldiers who had quietly trusted Abigail began aligning themselves with simple, rational tasks. Guard the wounded, hold the crossing, protect the makeshift village. Not triumphant, not dramatic, necessary. A final charge was ordered to end the drill with spectacle. Officers wanted a triumph to erase the shame. The line advanced unevenly. Feet pounded. Voices broke. When the front reached the ridge, a false signal sounded. A horn blown from the wrong flank. The charge veered. Bodies tangled. A boy fell. His musket skittered down the slope. He did not rise. Abigail reached him first. She checked his breath, then lifted him by the shoulders and dragged him clear. Mud streaked her forearms. She whispered something only he heard. The men around her steadied. They formed a protective crescent as the surge collapsed into exhaustion. Across the field, the captains finally called ceasefire. Late, grudging, defeated by their own noise. Silence returned, raw and honest. No cheer rose, no victory declared. Only the weary hush of people learning a harsh lesson. Independence is not born from spectacle. It is carved from duty, from restraint, from the refusal to let contempt rule. The officers regrouped, faces tight, reputations fraying at the edges. Some blamed the drums. Some blamed the terrain. A few blamed Abigail. None blamed their vanity. Yet in the eyes of the common soldiers there was a different verdict, a revelation that could not be smothered. They had seen who kept them from disaster. They had seen who risked herself without asking for praise. They had seen a path toward dignity that did not depend on rank. Dusk gathered over the field, washing the camp in iron-grey light. Fires sparked to life. Men cleaned their muskets in silence, heads bowed, hearts awake. Abigail rinsed the mud from her hands at the creek, the water cold, the current steady. She felt the weight of the day settle in her bones, but beneath it a quiet certainty. Choices were forming in the dark, decisions that would shape allegiances, expose secrets, and force the camp to decide what kind of liberty it truly sought. From the officers' tent came low, urgent voices. From the lines, a flicker of resolve. And above them all, The wind carried the faint scent of rain, as if the sky itself held back, waiting for the moment when truth would finally break and wash the field clean. A heavy stillness settled over the camp after the disastrous drill. Lanterns flickered in the gathering dusk, their trembling light reflecting on faces that carried more doubt than hope. Officers paced in tight circles, muttering excuses, desperate to reclaim an authority slipping like sand through their fingers. The common soldiers watched in silence. They had endured shame, confusion, and degradation from men who claimed to defend liberty, yet could not even command their own pride. Something had shifted, something deep, something irreversible. It happened when the officers attempted a final demonstration to salvage their pride. They unfurled a rough map on a crate, arguing over placements, over imagined threats, over who deserved to lead the next maneuver. Voices clashed, orders overlapped. The men grew restless. Abigail approached only because the younger soldiers begged her to speak reason before chaos consumed them again. She moved quietly, her steps measured, her posture calm. The officers barely noticed her at first. They were too busy accusing each other of incompetence. But when two captains barked opposing commands at the same unit, pushing the weary recruits into another collision, Abigail stepped forward. She placed her hand on the map and traced a line with steady precision, outlining a simple, flawless strategy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her clarity alone cut through the noise. One officer scoffed, calling her a meddling civilian. Another mocked her presence. A third, red-faced and trembling with wounded ego, demanded to know who had given her permission to speak. The insults rose like a wave, contempt hiding fear. Abigail lifted her gaze. Her eyes held no anger, only certainty. And with a voice quiet enough to force them to lean in, she delivered the sentence that froze the entire field. Unless you hold more authority than a commander of Washington, follow the plan. Silence detonated across the camp. Men stopped sharpening blades. Drummers paused mid-beat. Recruits straightened. Breaths caught in their throats. Even the officers stiffened, their pride pierced cleanly by the weight of her words. It was not the volume, nor the sharpness, but the undeniable truth behind them. They knew Washington's discipline. They knew his expectations. They knew the cost of defying him, and Abigail had invoked his command with a confidence none of them could challenge. For a heartbeat, the camp stood suspended between disgrace and awakening. The captain who had shouted the loudest earlier took a step back, his jaw rigid, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Another officer swallowed hard, struggling to hide the tremor in his hands. Every man there understood what her phrase implied. Her plan aligned with the principles of the very leader they pretended to serve. Their failures did not. Their arrogance did not. Their betrayal of discipline did not. Slowly, the murmurs spread. A single ripple of realization, then respect. Not loud, not spoken, but real. Soldiers who had endured humiliation felt their dignity rise. Farmers who had been shoved aside stood taller. Veterans scarred by English cruelty felt a spark of independence burn a little brighter. Abigail had not claimed power. She had enforced order where pride had strangled it. The officers, cornered by truth, reluctantly obeyed. They stepped aside. They allowed her to outline the movements. They listened, not out of courtesy, but because resistance now felt like rebellion against the very cause they claimed to defend. For the first time since her arrival, Abigail's voice carried official weight. Not by rank, by necessity. She moved through the camp with quiet, direction, assigning positions, calming nerves, restoring cohesion shattered by vanity. Every decision she made revealed a hidden depth the officers still could not explain. Her journey had shaped her into something rare, a guardian forged by loss and conviction, not medals. A protector of the weak who asked for nothing but the chance to help them survive. Night thickened around the campfires, yet a different kind of light spread through the ranks, a sense of purpose, a whisper of transformation. The Patriots realized that rebellion was not only against English generals, but against every shadow that threatened their unity, including the shadows within their own command. Abigail felt their eyes on her, some grateful, some wary, some shaken by revelations they did not yet understand. And beneath the surface of that gathering stillness, she sensed a storm approaching, not of muskets or cavalry, but of decisions that would test every loyalty in the camp, including her own. The darkness deepened, carrying with it the promise that the next moment, the next breath, would change the course of their struggle forever. They assembled in the chill before dawn, breath whitening in the dark, hearts still raw from disgrace. Abigail stood at the map once more, but there was no argument now. She set the line with steady hands. Skirmishers to the hedgerow, reserved by the creek bend, couriers assigned, drummers briefed on a single cadence, lanterns shuttered, civilians marked by straw, figures and a few elders who volunteered for realism, clearly protected behind a drawn boundary that no boot would cross. Her voice carried without strain, short, precise, every order anchored to purpose, not pride. The signal came soft as a heartbeat. One tap. The ranks moved. No stumbling, no competing shouts. The pickets slid into position, muskets angled low, eyes sweeping the tree line rather than the ground at their feet. A young farmer who once shook at every command now matched his, breathing to the drum. A grey-haired militiaman guarded the crossing with quiet resolve. Where panic had lived, discipline took root. The transformation felt almost sacred. Abigail walked the line like a compass needle. She corrected posture with a touch to the elbow, not a bark. She paired the weakest with the calmest. She placed the proudest officer where his daring would do no harm and his vanity would be starved by duty. When the staged assault began, Patriots playing the enemy once more, the defense did not splinter. Pickets released 2 volleys, then fell back behind the village markers exactly as she had drawn. No trampling, no shame. The reserve advanced only when she lifted her hand. The cadence held. A flanking feint tested the left. She was there first, already reading the ground, already marking a wedge of cover no one else had noticed. Her orders were few. A look, a point, a curt hold. The line obeyed. The feint broke against the patience she demanded. Where impatience had once demanded spectacle, she taught restraint. Where confusion once multiplied, she required silence. Dignity began to breathe again. Men felt it. A young recruit who had been pushed to the mud earlier now carried himself like a sentinel. He covered a wounded comrade during the mock retreat with deliberate courage. No flourish, no craving of praise. Sacrifice, stripped of theatrics. Another soldier, poor, thin, eyes too old for his face, took up the role of runner and delivered messages. Exactly, not embellishing a single word. Truth moved faster than vanity, and efficiency followed. Even the officers could not deny what was unfolding. Their protests shrank to hard swallows and clenched jaws. One tried to reassert himself with a brusque command that contradicted the plan. Abigail turned, met his stare, and simply tapped the map pinned to her forearm. The man held his breath, then nodded, as though he had just remembered what allegiance meant. The second phase began, a controlled withdrawal to draw the enemy across the creek. Drummers switched to the agreed cadence. No one spoke out of turn. The first rank stepped back on a count of 3. The second filled the space without rushing. The village markers stood untouched, ringed by guards who understood what independence is for. The child, the mother, the elder who cannot run. The movement was beautiful in its austerity, a choreography of purpose rather than pride. For the first time the encampment looked like a real army. Abigail's mind did not rest. She scanned for seams and found them before they tore. She sent 2 steady men to watch the right bend where fog pooled thickest. She shifted powder from the wagons without fanfare, making sure no unit would go dry at a critical moment. She kept the surgeons informed and the waterline clear. Logistics, usually ignored by the vein, became a living artery under her care. The final push came by design, not impulse. The enemy advanced, loud and theatrical, hoping to bait a rash countercharge like before. Her reply was a thin smile. She let them tire against an invisible net. Measured fire, a staggered step, a sudden quiet that unnerved the aggressors. Then she raised 2 fingers. The reserve swept left, not to dazzle, but to close a door. The flanking force found itself facing calm barrels and steady eyes. No shouting, no rush, just inevitability. The horn sounded surrender for the drill's end, and a long exhale rolled through the field like wind through wheat. Silence, but not the old kind. Not the hush of shame. A stillness full of understanding. Men looked at their hands as if they belonged to them again. They looked at the village markers still standing, at the elders untouched, at the creek crossing held with quiet defiance. They had tasted order without cruelty, strength without contempt, leadership without humiliation. Whispers turned to nods, nods to a humble pride. No cheer rose, it wasn't needed. Respect hardened into something, stronger than applause, a promise. The promise that liberty would not be built on the backs of the broken, but with their hands. That independence without honor was merely another chain. The officers approached her in a small cluster, carrying the awkwardness of men facing their own reflection. One offered a stilted acknowledgement. Another, more honest, asked for the written plan to study. A third simply stood in silence, the set of his mouth less cruel than it had been at dawn. They did not crown her with rank. They didn't dare. But they stopped sneering. And that, in a world accustomed to contempt, felt like the opening of a gate. All day the camp worked to reset in the image of what they had learned. Sentries rotated without quarrel. Drills shortened, sharpened, then halted, before exhaustion turned discipline into farce. Bread was divided more fairly. Water was measured, not hoarded. A boy with blistered palms received a strip of cloth without judgment. Small mercies, powerful reforms. The shape of a future army flickered into being. Yet beneath the new order, under the murmured praise and the earned quiet, a question crept like frost. Who had taught Abigail to lead like this? Who had carved such skill into her bones? The hidden truth pressed against the canvas of her composure, asking to be named. Some suspected a past bound to frontier strife. Others guessed a husband lost to English brutality. The grief turned into discipline. A few dared to wonder if she had once served under a commander whose name carried the weight of nations. She gave them no answer. Her journey had taught her that revelations arrive when they must, not when pride demands them. As evening fell, a watchman reported movement far out near the ridge. Perhaps deer, perhaps scouts, perhaps nothing. The camp tightened its lines without panic. No rush, no vanity. The lesson held. Abigail stood at the center, listening to the drum of distant water over stones, to the soft clink of buckles, settling to the breath of men who finally believed they could stand together. Order had been restored. Dignity had been lifted from the mud. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from beyond the hills, too faint to read, too stubborn to ignore. Men glanced toward the dark horizon. Abigail did not move. Her eyes narrowed, not with fear, but with recognition. The day had forged an army out of the broken. Now the night seemed intent on discovering whether that new strength could bear the weight of what waited just beyond the trees. Night pressed over the camp like a verdict. The wind carried whispers of the day's transformation, yet also the weight of secrets too long restrained. Abigail stood apart, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the last embers. She had guided them through disorder, raised them from disgrace, restored a sense of unity they had nearly destroyed with their own pride. The men felt it. The officers feared it. Something about her presence made truth unavoidable. It arrived with the soft crunch of boots over frost. A courier stepped into the lantern's edge carrying a single sealed document, Washington's own mark pressed into the wax. Eyes widened. No one spoke. Abigail broke the seal with absolute calm. She read in silence, then folded the message with the finality of a sentence already known in her marrow. When she turned, her voice carried the weight of liberty itself. "I was never here to fight the British," she said. "My charge was to measure your discipline, your honor, your worthiness to defend a nation still unborn." Shock rippled through the ranks. Men blinked in disbelief. Officers straightened as though stabbed. The proudest among them trembled when she handed the letter to the captain in charge. He read it under the wavering lantern light, his face draining as each line revealed the truth. Washington had stationed Abigail as his hidden emissary, a sentinel sent not to glory, but to observe the soul of the camp, to judge whether they carried the dignity needed to win independence or the rot that could doom it. The reprimand came swift and merciless. Arrogant officers stripped of rank, others reassigned to lesser duties, their vanity laid bare beneath the cold stars. No man dared to protest. Their own failures had become undeniable. They bowed their heads not to Abigail, but to the principles they had betrayed. As the camp absorbed the revelation, Abigail prepared her horse. There was no triumph in her posture, only the quiet sorrow of someone who had seen too much shame, too much broken pride, too much fragile rebellion jeopardized by ego. She mounted without ceremony. A few soldiers stepped forward to thank her, voices trembling with respect. She simply nodded, the gesture carrying more grace than any speech. Those men would never forget the woman who had taught them to stand straight, not through authority, but through example. She rode out before dawn, just as the first pale ribbon of light bled across the horizon. Behind her, the encampment stood silent and humbled. No arguments, no mockery, no hollow pride, only reflection, only the whisper of a nation beginning to understand that liberty is not claimed in words, but earned in sacrifice, discipline, and the willingness to bury arrogance for the sake of something greater. The soldiers watched her silhouette fade into the mist. For the first time they felt the weight and worth of their journey. They realized that independence demanded more than muskets or declarations. It demanded transformation. It demanded humility. It demanded the courage to confront their own failures so they could rise stronger than the empire that sought to crush them. In that stillness, as the sun finally crested the hills, the spirit of rebellion flickered with renewed fire. A camp once fractured now breathed as one. Abigail's departure left an emptiness, yes, but also a legacy, a compass pointing toward a future carved by resilience instead of pride. And in the hearts of those men, her final lesson took root. The struggle for dignity begins within. If you felt this story burn with emotion and courage, let me know your thoughts. Your like and subscription help this humble channel continue telling the timeless journey of those who fought, bled, and dreamed for the eternal flame of liberty.